Good morning. It's 10:30, and I see that we have most of the good people are here, so I think we can go ahead and start now. I have a couple of announcements, and one is that remember in September we had our community service officers here, and they suggested that we try to schedule coffee with a cop. That will occur on Thursday, a week from this Thursday, October 26th at 11 to 1 in the Fireside Lounge. And it's just come, sit, chat, leave. It's not a meeting. It's not a formal meeting. Nobody has to come and sit for 2 hours. It's drop in, say hello, ask a question, listen. I'm very excited that they are willing to do this for Horizon House. Frequently when they do this, it's at an actual coffee shop. So we're a little different from their normal setup for this. Joan has an illness, which she says is not COVID, and we will hope it's not. She is not able to be here today, and so she's very nervous about me forgetting to announce that in our November League meeting, we will be hosting Nick Licata. Nick was a city council member in Seattle for quite a few years, and he wrote, oh, Lord, now I've done it. I've forgotten the title of his book. Anybody remember? Somebody will, yes. What's the title?
I have the book.
You have the book.
I remember, it has to do with activism.
It does have to do with activism. Oh, yes, it has to do with activism, and I don't know what the title is now. Anyway, Nick is a fascinating guy, and I really enjoyed his time on the council. The point of his talk in November will be how to interact productively with your city council. So how to know what they're doing and how to choose an issue and work on it with a member of the council and their staff. And I think it will be fabulous for us because my guess is each one of us has some sort of a little thing bee in our bonnet about something pertaining to the city of Seattle. So I'm very much looking forward to that meeting. Today, we are talking about the news. And there's a couple of issues related to the news. Oh, sorry. Yes, Ann. Do you want a microphone? Sorry, didn't ask.
I was a little late getting here. I apologize to our presenters and to all of you. I've passed out a flyer that announces the Healthcare for All Washington annual meeting and educational forum, which will be here next Saturday from 1 to 3. You're all invited. Encourage you to come. You can read about the program, and I will be looking for volunteers to help as greeters, and I thank you in advance for your help.
Thank you. We've always been kind of a focal point for Healthcare for All, so that's handy when they bring their meetings to us. Very thoughtful of them to do that. I'm turning this off, going back to this. Does that still work? All right, thank you, Ann. Sorry. So the news, couple of issues related to the news, and in the form of an announcement, I will say that this afternoon at 2:30, my other little venture here called Another Point of View will be talking about where we get our news, whether it's print or online or TV or what. So how to find alternative points of view, because that's one of my concerns. But today, we're talking about simply the survival of newspapers and news publications, which now has many different formats, throughout the country. And especially part of it is in communities outside of our big cities. How do people in those areas get the news? As you know, I spent 10 years living in the boondocks of Skagit County, and my entire thinking about everything related to citizens and government changed when I was out there. And government felt distant from me in a way that it never had before. And so part of what we need to think about today is how do we keep people connected with their governments in communities of many different sizes and variations, and unrestricted by owners who have agendas. So, Brier Dudley, product of Washington, Whitman College, proud local person, is in charge of the Save the Free Press effort at the Seattle Times, which has been going on for a while, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from him. When he's finished, our other guest, Ray Miller-Still, is the editor for the Enumclaw Courier Herald. Did I get that right?
Yeah, you got that right.
You know, half the time I say Issaquah, Eatonville.
It took me 6 years, not 6 years, 6 months in order to be able to pronounce my own city name right. So don't worry about it.
Yes, close to. Thunder Mountain has big winds. Anyway, he doesn't have a presentation per se, but he's here to field your questions. And he is also a product of Washington and went to Evergreen State College before it blew up in 2017. So, Brier, it is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. This is neat. I've always wondered about this place, and I might be preaching to the choir a bit here. You know, people think about newspapers and the demographics that are reading newspapers, and I probably have a lot of likely Seattle Times readers in the audience, so thank you very much for your support. I have a weird job in the newspaper business. I am the only reporter in the country who is full-time covering the local journalism crisis. And I've been doing this for 2.5 years now. I was an editorial writer before. I worked before that. I was a tech columnist at the Seattle Times for a long time. I've done all kinds of stuff. I've been there about 26 years now. My title is Free Press Editor, which is sort of presumptuous. I'm sorry. Somebody else gave it to me. But my job is to write about all the different challenges that the newspaper industry is facing in the United States and globally, and to also advocate for solutions to hopefully stop the steep decline in local journalism and find ways to make it a sustainable business, because it's so important to our country, to civic engagement, to democracy. I write for the opinion page, if you're wondering. Do you want me to be a little louder here? I write for the opinion page, so I'm opinionated. I know you all might be aware of this. We still have people in our community who get a little bit confused about that. The reporters on one side of the building are separate from the people in our opinion department. The reporters strive for objectivity. That's something we continue to work on. We have standards we pursue that differentiates us from other types of news organizations. On the opinion side, we also have standards, but we are trying to influence opinion. So if you think I sound opinionated, good. That's my job, is to try and influence people. So my slide deck here is a little bit old. Forgive me. I need to update this. We actually, the Seattle Times is a family-owned newspaper. It's owned by the Blethen family. The publisher, my boss, I work directly for Frank Blethen. He's the CEO publisher. He lives on Mercer Island. They've owned papers here since, about 127 years or so. We are one of the last big metro dailies that are owned independently by a family. There are 6,000 or so newspapers in the United States. That's down by about a fourth in the last 15 years. Out of those, most of them are now owned by hedge funds and chains that are milking them to death. We're at the point where 2 newspapers a week are closing in the United States. That rate of closure is supposed to be going up to probably 3 a week in the next couple of years. A lot of that is just because of consolidation. Newspapers, it's hard. It used to be every town had a couple of newspapers. It was a wonderful local business that people had. But as those independent families aged, they didn't have heirs to take over, or the business got too complicated, or they started losing money. They gradually sold out over and over and over and over again, to the point that there's really, Gannett is the largest newspaper publisher in the United States. They own more than half of the remaining newspapers. And a couple of hedge fund-backed folks own large swaths of the remaining newspapers. But in Washington State, we're actually relatively lucky. We're a special place in the country, as we all know, and we're special also because we still have daily newspapers that are owned by local families. Seattle, the Blethen family owns the Times. Spokane, the Cowles family owns the Spokesman Review. Columbia, the Campbell family owns, Vancouver, Washington, owns the Columbian. And we have smaller chains too that continue, like the Wenatchee World is owned by, it used to be a great local family publisher called the Woods family, advocated for the Grand Coulee Dam and all this. Now it's owned by a smaller family chain based in Arizona, the Wick family. But so we're lucky. And when I talk about this journalism crisis in Seattle, people might not believe the depth of the problem, because we have the Seattle Times, we have lots of little local weeklies, we have really interesting online news options available. We have multiple NPR stations available to us in Seattle. We have local broadcasters that are doing reporting. We have a real abundance of news here in Seattle, and we're really blessed in that regard. But if you go farther afield, frankly, you just go a little bit farther to the east or to the north or the south, you start to see what the problem is. The papers, probably papers that you grew up with, are gone. The East Side used to have multiple papers. They're all gone. The papers that remain, go a little bit farther north, papers are owned by chains that are disinvesting. Go west, Gannett owns the Kitsap Sun. I went to high school in Bremerton, and I used to think I wanted to work for the Bremerton Sun one of these days. Now there's about 3 or 4 reporters or something in there. It's really, really sad. You go down to Tacoma and Olympia, the papers are hollowed out. In the industry, we call them ghost newspapers, when they no longer have much of a newsroom anymore. And by the way, I'm very newspaper-centric in this conversation. Of course, we get local news from all sorts of sources. We get it from broadcast, we get it from social media. But there's been academic research that's found that even in markets where you have online options and broadcasters and everything else, newspapers continue to provide the majority of what we consider essential news, the news that people need to make their civic decisions, to be informed voters. And in fact, even in a market like Seattle, where we have all these options and things like that, well over 50–60% of the essential news reporting that keeps the community informed is coming from newspapers. So that's a big reason. Well, plus we're a newspaper company, so we really talk a lot about the importance of saving newspapers. And we also, as you all know probably, newspapers aren't just a printed thing anymore. We continue to use the term newspapers, but pretty much every newspaper in the country is now a digital product and a print product. Some of them are only digital products nowadays. In the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, one of the great newspaper of Georgia, is now all online only. The Seattle Times is actually another rarity in that we continue to print 7 days. I don't know, that's not going to last forever. If you go around the state of Washington, there are very few papers that are still printing daily. They even call themselves daily. In Oregon, I don't know that there's any 7-day papers left. The Oregonian just recently cut back to 3 days a week. So, once again, when you get outside of this special bubble that we're in Seattle, you'll really see the depth of this crisis. But a little bit about the Seattle Times. As I mentioned, this is old. we've actually found ways to continue while the rest of the industry has been kind of collapsing. And we had a very sharp downturn post 2000. We're much smaller. We're about half the size of when I started, but we've kind of leveled off and started growing a little bit more. In fact, our newsroom is about 175 journalists now. This is from 2 years ago. As we talk about this, we kind of like to go back a little bit to the founding of the free press system in the United States. And this is important. You know, when I took this job, I was a little uncomfortable about some of the positions that my boss had even been advocating for, which is the need for the government to help sustain the free press system. I mean, I was pretty diehard separation of the press. You know, government has nothing to do with the newspapers. But, you know, a history lesson tells you that there's actually been a more complicated relationship there. Since the founding of our country, the federal government has been subsidizing the press in various ways, and it continues to do so all the way through the current day. The Postal Act in 1792 actually was created in part to subsidize the distribution of early newspapers and newsletters, because the Founding Fathers realized how important it was that for the experiment in democracy to work, you had to have informed voters. In parallel, they realized we need a public education system, because to have voters that could, for a system to work, you need to have educated and informed voters, voters who could read. So we're pretty much part of the fabric of the country from the get-go. That postal subsidy continues. We still get a discounted rate, although it's much less and less and less. And newspapers kind of drifted away from using the post office to distribute, but now they're actually coming back to that a little bit more. In fact, we're even doing it in some parts of our circulation area. Newspapers increasingly are doing this because it's really hard to find delivery drivers nowadays. We're competing with Amazon and Uber and all these other folks that provide job opportunities to people that do that kind of work, and the cost of fuel is exorbitant. You know, we drive like 25,000 miles a day delivering the Seattle Times, so you can think about the cost of the fuel to do that. So we're already under a lot of pressure because our business model has been disrupted by technology. And it's not so much that we want to stop delivering newspapers, but we just need to find ways to survive. So the postal subsidy is increasingly important to the newspapers, once again. And, you know, I get a lot of pushback on this, too. People say, oh, you know, you're just looking for handouts. You know, newspapers aren't that special. But if you think, let's say you're a Fox News or an MSNBC news consumer, and that's where you get most of your news. If you think about it, those stations are actually subsidized by the government as well. Television broadcasts are broadcast through the air. That's real estate that's owned by us, the people. That is our real estate. This land is your land, so is the sky. And we sell access to that. And so we have provided access on our real estate in the sky to TV from the get-go. Nowadays, most people get their cable television through cable, which is run probably in here too. That cable comes to your building or your house across public real estate. That public real estate is basically rented. It's a privilege that those companies have to deliver that information to your house across public real estate. Cable companies reach deals with Seattle and every other municipality in the country. So basically those local governments are subsidizing the delivery of that news and information to you. So really just about any way you think about it, the news and information that you're accessing has been subsidized in some way by the government. Now, we're in a bit of a crisis mode with newspapers and local journalism. The point that our business model has been so blown up by the internet changes, and yes, some of it's our fault, we were slow to adapt. Some of it is also because competition, I think, is unfair right now. The federal government has not done much to regulate the rise of online monopolies. They're finally cracking down on Google and Facebook. Until that situation changes, we really don't have a fair playing field to compete for online digital ads, and that's retarding our ability to evolve into more fully digital products. During this transition period where we try to find a more level playing field online, we need to figure out a way to stop newspapers from closing left and right. You know, we've lost, more than half of the newspaper journalists in the United States have been laid off in the last 15 years. It's gone from like 70,000 to about 40,000 across the country. So the Seattle Times is advocating for a couple of things. One is a policy that has been proposed, actually it was originally introduced by a Republican from Sunnyside, Washington, Dan Newhouse. And the idea is a tax incentive, temporary tax credits that would provide $25,000 for the first year, $15,000 for the next 4 years for local newsrooms to retain their employees. And the idea is to kind of stabilize the industry, prevent any further layoffs while we figure out a way forward. It's large, it's generous, it's expensive. It cost about $1.8 billion. It nearly passed Congress last year in the Build Back Better bill, but it got stripped out at the very end. Then it came back in the defense authorization package, got stripped out in the very end. There's bipartisan support for this. A lot of Republicans, in fact, a new version was introduced this year by a Republican out of New York, Representative Tenney, and these representatives believe that it's critically important to maintain and preserve the free press system in the United States. They recognize the importance of local newspapers in doing that, and they realize that this isn't a permanent solution, that this is just a temporary way to kind of help us get over the hump in the transition. A second policy that we've been advocating for gets a little bit into the weeds. I hope you had your coffee this morning because it gets kind of boring, but it's called the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act. And this is an antitrust exemption that would allow newspapers to collectively bargain with Google and Facebook to get a better deal. Because so much of the news nowadays is consumed online through Google and Facebook. If you see smoke on the horizon and you wonder what's going on, you might just go Google, what's the smoke behind First Hill? And Google will present you a list of things, and they'll have these little snippets, and they've assembled them from various news sources. It's very convenient. You probably can get the gist of what's going on just by doing that. You don't have to actually click through to the Seattle Times. So then Google makes the money from the ads that you see. Google makes the money from the traffic, the web traffic they received. The news organizations, the Seattle Times, the Eatonville Courier, the King 5, or whoever else is out there actually reporting on what that smoke is, they very rarely get the benefit, the advertising sales and everything else, because people are just getting that information on the platforms. So to address this, the newspaper industry is trying to work out a deal, basically, work out an arrangement so we get a fairer share of the benefit from our news reporting. Australia did this 2 years ago. It's been a wild success. They had a law they passed that required Google and Facebook to negotiate with newspaper organizations. That's led to a renaissance there. People are even having trouble hiring in newsrooms because there's been so much hiring. There's been newspapers there that said they were going to be laid off. They were going to close, and they have not, because now they have a steady source of revenue. Now, it's not that Google and Facebook are going to pay to save news completely. This would be, one of the things that's necessary, one of the sources of revenue that's necessary to help us survive as we become more digital. The Journalism Competition Preservation Act was sponsored by U.S. Senator Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota, whose dad was a very famous newspaper columnist in Minnesota. She's just been a tremendous advocate. It has bipartisan support. It's also got real close to the finish line a few times, and we're trying again this year. I don't really understand why it has, actually I do understand. The reason it hasn't gotten across the finish line in Congress is because there's intense opposition to this by Google and Facebook. Canada actually passed a similar bill this last summer. You might have read about this in some of my columns. And Google and Facebook kind of went nuclear on that. Facebook said, and they've basically said, we're not going to display any news anymore on our platforms. They'd rather block all news on their platforms there than compensate news outlets for their reporting. And they've threatened to do the same thing in the United States. So prepare for that kind of a blockade, perhaps, to happen by the end of the year. I think it's horrible when they do that because it hurts the public. It hurts people who maybe don't have a subscription to a news outlet, or maybe just when you have let's say we had an earthquake. and everybody was trying to find out what was going on and where they could get emergency supplies or whatever, they'd be dependent on social media as well as on TV news, radio news, and newspapers. And so it's a very dangerous game for the platforms to play. They did the same thing in Australia, and it was temporary, by the way. They blocked news temporarily for everybody in Australia, and they had wildfires, and it caused all kinds of problems. But it was a tactical thing they did to avoid paying for news. So if you care about the future of news and local news, and you think that seems like a reasonable plan to let us collectively bargain with the platforms, I encourage you to contact your representatives and encourage them to support the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act. Washington's delegation has been very supportive about it. Most members of our delegation are very supportive, but things are kind of in turmoil in Congress. So we'll see what happens throughout the rest of the year. There are very large pressing things that are obviously of much greater import, and Ukraine and Israel and everything else. So fingers crossed, everything settles down in Congress. The United States provides clear and direct leadership on all these issues, including saving its newspapers. By the way, when I say antitrust with the JCPA, the reason that we need an antitrust exemption is because newspapers can't get together and bargain together. That would be, we can't do that. Book publishers tried to do that with Amazon a few years ago, and they ran into trouble with antitrust regulation. They couldn't team up together to negotiate with Amazon. And so the newspaper industry wants to avoid that trouble and get a 5 to 8 year exemption from antitrust law that lets us together bargain. Now, this is especially needed for smaller newspapers, like local newspapers, Seattle Times size and down, because the big ones can already do this. In fact, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, which is owned by News Corp, Fox, those kind of folks, they've already made these kind of deals. They really, they know how important it is. Google and Facebook have said, yeah, we're taking your stuff. We need to figure out a fair way to compensate you for it. And so they've made these deals already. The people that are left now are all the smaller newspapers that don't have the heft and the leverage and the teams of lawyers and business people to negotiate these deals. So that's really what we're asking for, is that everybody else kind of gets parity on this approach. I'm going way off on my slide deck here, sorry. I was going to give you sort of a history lesson from when we went to the postal subsidy in 1792, and we had a blossoming of newspaper industries across the United States. A turning point came in the late 1960s when Gannett was the first newspaper company to go public. And Gannett's done wonderful journalism. It's a neat company in some ways, but that surely changed things. Suddenly newspapers were no longer answering primarily to their readers and the local business community that advertised in them. Suddenly newspapers began the newspaper companies increasingly were answering to Wall Street. Quarterly returns were became more important than serving their community in public service. I think and that has played out over the last 50 years. Of course, the big blow came around 2000 when the .com implosion happened. Newspapers were kind of holding their own okay, but then when the .com crash happened, the newspaper crash happened, advertising, it all went down, and that's when we really began to see the deep, deep, deep decline in the news industry. One problem that we're a little bit self-imposed was we were all so excited about the internet in the early days that we just gave our news away. In fact, we had a lot of people telling us, oh, give your news away online and you'll get so many people coming to your website, you'll make a fortune. That turned out to be bogus, and we got taken to the cleaners on that. And we pretty much conditioned people to expect to get news for free online. And we've been slowly trying to walk that back. You're probably familiar with the way it works online now. If you go to a newspaper site, they might let you look at a couple of stories, and then you have to pay. That's called a paywall in our industry. Seattle Times has one. The New York Times put theirs up in 2011, and they're a bit of a bellwether for the industry. Kind of convinced a lot of other folks to follow suit. The Wall Street Journal has been doing it all along. They never did give their news away for free. And they've remained strong and have millions of subscribers online. Some newspapers are still kind of back and forth on this. I'd be kind of curious to hear what Ray's take is on how they do that. At the community newspapers are some of the last to erect these paywalls. They still are more reliant on local advertising and subscriptions. This has been important because as technology disrupted our business, we used to rely on advertising primarily. We made so much money from advertising, it kind of subsidized the cost of delivery. But we've lost most of our advertising. At the same time, Google and Facebook's advertising has soared. That's pretty much where it all went. So we are now dependent mostly on subscription revenue. That's what's paying the bills at newspapers like ours. We still depend on advertising a lot, but subscriptions is where it's at for us. So that's why we have to have paywalls, and that's why there's so much emphasis on digital growth. As I mentioned, since 2000, this is old also, the number of papers that have closed is well over 2,500. Academic at the University of North Carolina began documenting this. She just coined the term news deserts to describe the situation we're in, where we have, and if you're members of the League of Women Voters, you might have seen the terrific study the League produced, and it has a lot of the same stuff in it. So we have news deserts spreading all across the country. It's fabulous reporting and data that helps bring shape to this conversation. It's funny though, in Washington State, they described Washington's only news desert was in the southeast corner, according to this research. But the Lewiston Morning Tribune in Lewiston, Idaho, actually has a reporter that's now covering that area. So we don't really have a news desert in Washington State now. But at the same time, the newspapers that are left are mostly just thinned out, gutted out, hollowed out, and they're doing so little news coverage, it's barely doing what we're supposed to do. Yeah, this says 30,000. We're getting close to 40,000 local journalism jobs have been lost. When newspapers disappear, there are all kinds of harms to the community. You don't have people, there's been one study found that 60% of the people in places that don't have newspapers don't know who their mayor is, which kind of blows your mind when you think those people have to go vote. And I think that this is part of the reason we have so much division and toxic political dialogue in the US nowadays too. It's because everything gets nationalized. The local newspaper goes away. You kind of lose touch with people in your community. You don't really engage as much with issues or what's going on, but you still get news. But you get news increasingly from the internet and from cable TV, where everything gets put through a partisan lens, and so everything is sort of a right-left argument. And it's a real shame, because most of the things that we should care about and be involved with as citizens are not partisan issues. And it's got to the point that, Seattle wants to build a park here, and then you look at the dialogue about it, it's like, oh, this is the crazy liberals or the cuckoo right-wingers. And so you can't just have a normal conversation anymore about these things. There's so few people reading the news or getting the newspaper that you don't have the shared facts to have a good dialogue about things. And if it's a political topic, you immediately kind of veer into this right-left thing, which is a false choice. So what can we do about it? As I mentioned, there's the federal efforts to figure out a temporary tax situation to help newspapers. There's the antitrust reform to help us better negotiate with platforms. We also encourage people to subscribe. We're doing pretty well subscription-wise, but it's still kind of shocking to me how few people subscribe to newspapers, especially when elections roll around. I think, how do people know who to vote for? We vote for the president every 4 years. We'll get plenty of information about the president, but how do you know who to vote for on King County Council or City of Seattle or all the way down? Even we struggle to cover all the different things that are on the ballot. You all know what the ballots look like. And how many of those topics are covered by MSNBC and CNN and Fox News? You know, and if you don't read the newspaper, your source of information is the voter's guide, which is written by the candidates themselves, so you're not getting any objective information or no vetting, no checking, fact-checking on the claims made there. Washington State has actually been a leader in helping address this problem. The League of Women Voters report is part of this. We're very grateful for that. We had the legislature in the last year pass a 10-year tax break for newspaper publishers. There's a B&O tax exemption. We actually had a B&O tax exemption since 2009 or so. When Boeing came in and got its big tax breaks, other manufacturers also sought a B&O tax break. The argument was we need to save manufacturing in Washington. Well, we actually are a manufacturer too. We have a big, huge factory, and it's now in Kent, where we produce newspapers. You know, it's a lot of blue-collar folks working in there and the big trucks coming and everything else. So we were eligible for a manufacturing tax break as well. That expires next year. Because the situation is so dire for local newspapers in Washington, a bipartisan group in the legislature decided, hey, we need to not only extend that tax break, but we're going to reduce the B&O tax to zero for newspapers for 10 years, which is wonderful. That will save $10 million for the industry over 10 years. And you know that translates to a lot more reporters who aren't going to lose their job, and a lot more communities that will continue to have people keeping them informed and holding their officials accountable. So I've been going a bit. I'd really like to hear from Ray. By the way, this stuff, obviously there's self-interest for the Seattle Times in advocating for these things, but the Seattle Times is doing okay. We have a strong market. We have wonderful supporters, people like you. We've found new ways to sustain our business by partnering with philanthropies around here. We were one of the first papers to do that in the country. We kind of pioneered this model about 10 years ago where the education crisis in Washington demanded solutions. We wanted to increase our coverage of it, but we didn't really have the resources. We worked with the Gates Foundation, and they helped fund our education lab. And so when we were really able to step up our reporting and advocate for solutions on education, which has paid great dividends, we also then worked with folks on a traffic lab and on a Project Homeless, same model where we had some of the generous benefactors in the Seattle area supported targeted coverage of the homelessness issue. More recently, Steve Ballmer, the former Microsoft CEO, and his wife donated money to help us step up coverage of mental health, and that's just been terrific. We've been able to hire more people, and we have 25 or so reporters now that are supported by this philanthropic model. If you're wondering, they don't tell us what to write. Mr. Ballmer and Mr. Gates don't come in and say, you must do this. In fact, they have no say whatsoever in what we actually write. They just gave us resources to increase coverage of topic areas. We retain everything, all editorial decision-making, and also we're transparent about it. We let people know what's going on. That's also really important because trust in the media has really declined over the last 8 to 10 years. I think some of that is because there were politicians that didn't want to be held accountable, so they tried to reduce our credibility, and that was very effective. I also think it's because people just don't read us anymore. There's so many other things online. They don't really know what we do anymore, I think. And also, the news industry needs to be more transparent and clear, and that's part of the reason I'm here. And when we get a grant from Steve Ballmer, we need to let people know what it is and what the guardrails are around that and what influence he has. And when we advocate for things like the tax credits and stuff, we need to make it clear that we are not going to be beholden to Congress. We wouldn't take the money from them if we were. If they pass those tax credits, they'll have no say whatsoever in what we do. And like I said, we wouldn't want a tax credit that led to them having influence over us. But we're also in desperate straits, and we'd like to survive for another 50 years, and we think that there's hope for us to build new business models if we can just make it that far. So anyway, I'll let Ray go ahead, and I'll be here for questions too after.
Were you uncomfortable bending over like that the entire time? You just looked like you were... Hear me with this one? There we go. I like this a lot better. Hi, guys. Ray Miller still with the Enumclaw Courier Herald newspaper. Just a little bit of history about me. I wanted to be a journalist since middle school, where I had the opportunity to take a muckraking class where I read some of the longer form books. Fast Food Nation, No Logo, that really got me interested in this work. So ever since then, I worked at the high school newspaper, started writing the college newspaper that I went to, and then got a job at the Courier Herald. Thought I would go and join a larger paper after getting some notches under my belt, but instead I bought a house and started a family. So Enumclaw's got its claws in me. I'm not leaving. I'm one of those ghost newspapers that Brier mentioned here. When I started 9 years ago as a reporter, there was a staff of 20. We had 3 sales folks, we had in-house advertising arts folks, office manager, book manager, all that sort of thing. I'm now down to a staff of 3, and I'm the only writer. And unlike Brier here, I get to do both news and opinion. But I try really hard not to stick my nose into writing opinion about local issues. I'll try and stick to opinions that don't really affect the Enumclaw area. So I don't do endorsements. I don't write about, what's happening over at the school district or local elections. That's all news. I'll write about pit bull bans and letting folks of the LGBTQ community donate blood, which I think finally was allowed to happen recently. But yeah, I'm a staff of 1 now. It's kind of nuts. I had an intern for 3 months. That helped me out a lot. But now it's pretty much just me writing everything from traffic issues to school board races. We're the only news agency in the Enumclaw, Buckley, Black Diamond Plateau area that covers that sort of thing. So I'm really happy that I get to provide that sort of service to my readers. But trying to reach them is another matter. Traditionally, the Courier Herald was a free product that got delivered to you whether you wanted it or not. And we got more than a few calls from people saying, take us off your list. You're littering the gutters. So my company said, finally, all right, fine, then we're going to make it subscriber only. I didn't like that. But the pitch was to advertisers that now these are the number of readers that are going to read the paper. This is the true number of folks paying attention to the paper. So I think our circulation went from 10,000 to 1,500, which was a real shame, and I did not like that. Now we're pushing 2,000 again, which is really nice and growing incrementally. We enacted a soft paywall. I think you get 3 articles per month, and then you got to sign up. I do have the option of occasionally hitting that disable paywall option on the news stories, because I'm not only just the writer for opinion and news, I also manage the website, do social media, do the photography. I have some freelancers that do that for me occasionally, and sometimes I even have money to pay them. But for the most part, it's a one-man show. I've learned to juggle many balls. I'm trying to remember the last time I went to work and didn't grind my teeth at one time. It's difficult. And there's a lot of attacks lobbied my way. Just, being accused of being partisan. I try not to be. Over-opinionated. Sometimes I am. But right now, I got the writing down, and I got the news reporting down. What I need is a bigger paper and more transparency. So now that I'm in charge of everything, and I realize shrinking down from a staff of 20 to 3 has meant we've had to pull away from our community. We're no longer present at all the chamber meetings. We're no longer always able to be there at every single city council meeting. It's just not possible for 3 people to do. So we're working at kind of clawing back that sort of community presence. And I do think that a newspaper itself as a physical product is a community pillar. If that goes away, civic education goes away, civic engagement goes away, and people just get their news off Facebook. I know you're going to talk about that later. Just ignore news on Facebook, please. go to the website directly. So I actually hold meetings like this with far fewer people at a brewery that used to be my old offices until we went down to a staff of 3 and we were yelling at each other across a 20,000 square foot space. That just wasn't working out. So now it's a brewery, and now I go over there every first Wednesday and grab a cold one, and folks who want to talk about local news come in and meet with me. And I feel like that's it's a small effort right now. I'm still trying to get the word out about this sort of thing. But I feel like that's a way for folks to come in and see that I'm an actual person. I think just like everywhere on social media, we forget that there are people on the other side of that screen. So being able to come and see me and talk with me and ask me my opinion on what's happening in Enumclaw, why I cover what I cover, why I organize a news story like that, or I'm trying to get more people who are dissidents who disagree with me to come in. Either way, showing people that I'm there and I'm available. My office door is open. You can email me, you can call me, and I will respond. I think is a great way for us as a really local paper. We only cover 3 cities to show that you can trust me, you can talk to me, you can ask me questions, and I will do my best to give you a very honest answer. We got a social media push out there. The Courier Herald is joined with 8, 9, maybe even a dozen community pages at this point. So if there's news happening in Buckley, I'll just try to share the story over on that community site. Enumclaw, same thing. Black Diamond, same thing. And that gets actually a lot more online traffic than just posting on our Facebook page. So I'm seeing massive increases in people following us, people liking our social media page. I don't know quite yet how it's transferring to readership. I think a lot of people read the headlines and then decide to form an opinion, which doesn't work out particularly well because I get so frustrated going through all the answers. Be like, I can answer that question, that question, that question by reading the article. Just please click into it. Please subscribe. Come on. You described a whole bunch of philanthropic efforts that the Seattle Times is engaged in. That's really where I think the newspaper industry has to go right now. At least a little bit. It's my pipe dream to start a Friends of the Courier Herald nonprofit to focus on arts in South King County. That way I can get King County arts grants to basically buy ads in the paper and fund a part-time reporter to report on arts from Enumclaw all the way up to Renton, that sort of thing. Oh, speaking of chains, I forgot to mention this. My company, Sound Publishing, I think might be the largest newspaper owner in Washington, if not the most, at least one of. So if you see a paper with reporter at the end of it, Brier mentioned the closing of the Redmond Reporter, the Bellevue Reporter, all those were Sound Publishing. Renton just unfolded again, which is fantastic. The community really wanted the Renton Reporter back, so my company opened it back up. Sound Publishing bought my paper in the early aughts. It's been reporting on the Enumclaw area since 1901. I have all of my archives in my office. It's wonderful to go through. Yeah, got to start a nonprofit, got to find ways for people and organizations to give to us and support local news that is outside the traditional subscribe, read, visit the businesses that advertise on us model. On a national level, and I haven't seen a lot of conversation about this before, but I'm not an expert, I want to see something like the Corporation for Newspaper Publishing to get formed in Congress. We have the Corporation for Public Broadcasting to, fund PBS and other local stations that put out over the airwaves. I think doing something like a CNP would greatly benefit local news in the same way. So that's also one of my pipe dreams. I have no idea if that's even being explored or not. You can inform me on that later. But that's something I would like to see. So on a local level, nonprofits, on a larger level, national level, there's a lot of things we can do to support local news. The only problem is the politicians can't agree on anything right now. We're pretty dysfunctional. I've been really lucky that local businesses have continued to work in the advertise in the Courier Herald. There was one time in the early days of the pandemic that it looked like we were going to have to stop printing, at least for a couple weeks. So I said fine, and I finally donned a salesperson's hat, and I went and sold ads because that's what had to happen. And I got enough to keep us printing for those first weeks in there, and it just kept going ever since. But we went from a 20-page paper, and now we're lucky if we do an average of 12 a month. So we're just continuing to look for ways to engage, get people to trust me more, get people to subscribe, and get people to donate in some fashion to us. I have no idea how to run a nonprofit, so someone maybe like Grace, when she moves down the Enumclaw, will be able to help me out with that. Oh, we're a weekly. We come out every Monday. Today was our layout day, so I had to make sure everything was set to go before I got here, so fingers crossed everything happened the way I wanted it to happen. That's one thing they did take away from me. I used to also be the layout editor, and I still have trouble not micromanaging that, but I like the way my paper looks, and I don't like it when people change it.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand how often a week you publish.
Once a week. Yep, on Wednesdays. So unlike the Seattle Times, which is really up on daily news, I really focus on the larger issues. A road closure because of a crash might go up on our website, but I really try and focus on long-form journalism. I'm a little loquacious, so I need to probably rein that back a little bit, but I got a large article going out about an Enumclaw School District race and the Buckley Council race. The week after that, there's a school bond going out for $90 million for a new elementary school, and long-form stuff, which I like a lot. But that's what I'm thinking. That's my view. Hopefully we can figure out a way to continue the Courier Herald printing so we can celebrate 200 years when I'm long gone. So I guess I'm done up here, but if questions, I'm going to go sit on down and answer from there.
However, keep that and share it. Oops. Question.
How many editors do you employ?
Oh no, it's just me.
Oh, you're the only
Yeah,
one?
no, I'm the only
my
one. Yeah,
goodness.
it's a one-man show.
Oh, okay.
That is correct. I am print. When I was in college, the Cooper Point Journal went fully online, and we noticed that website traffic tanked, interaction with other college students and teachers tanked. So when I started on as a reporter, there was a big push to get it back into print. And once we did, we had to claw some of that support back, but eventually it happened. I don't know what's happening with them now. I'm no longer involved with the CPJ, but I think print is extremely important. Being able to see that paper is extremely important. If that physical product goes away, I don't think there's much for a community to hold on to, and an online digital product will only carry you so far.
Yeah, could you talk about the difference between for-profit and non-profit newspapers? Or like Crosscut, which is all digital, is a non-profit. The Seattle Times aim is to make money for the Blethyn family. And I don't know whether your publisher is non-profit, but are most newspapers for-profit organizations?
Most papers are for. Please.
Yeah. Over 92% of the papers in the United States are for-profit. So, yes, the Seattle Times does make money for the Blethyn family when it makes money, but they consider it to be a public service mission. And in fact, they sold off all their property in Seattle to keep the paper alive. So they could have built office buildings and said to heck with the newspaper, but they wanted to keep serving people. There is an interesting conversation in my world, in the Save Journalism circles, about for-profit versus nonprofit. There's a lot of emphasis now on not developing nonprofit news sites. There have been a lot that have emerged. Crosscut's one. Of course, the public radio stations are nonprofit. That's great. More the merrier. I personally think it's important to have for-profit because I think there's an engagement with the local communities there. You kind of have skin in the game with the community. and we need to and they can be permanently sustainable and free from the influence of donors, because nonprofits can be spend a lot of time trying to raise money. It diverts their energies, and they can get a lot of pressure from their donors to report things a certain way. Also, if you're a nonprofit, you can't make endorsements or you have to refrain from opining on political issues to maintain your nonprofit status. And I think it's important for newspapers to have opinion pages and editorials and things. And by the way, I think Ray's a real hero for doing what he's doing. I mean, these are the people out in the trenches that are doing what they can to keep people informed with little support from their owners, frankly. And it's just amazing. So.
I just want to clarify really quickly. There's no way Sound Publishing will ever turn the Courier Herald into a nonprofit paper like Real Change. If you guys have ever read that one here in Seattle, that is a nonprofit paper. But it would be a nonprofit arm that would be able to, through donations, specifically report on a particular topic. I chose arts because King County has a lot of available art grants that I think would be very easily targeted in order to fund this program. I'm also working with the local business chambers to do something very similar, for them to basically collectively, for the Buckley Chamber and the Enumclaw Chamber, buy basically 2 half-page ads, and then through revenue be able to hire a part-time reporter to do business-focused news. Don't know how that one will look like yet. They want to have their own writer. I clearly want to have my own. But really, at this point, I'm going to consider any option that allows the newspaper to grow, have more revenue come in, and I'll gladly trade off a part-time business reporter not under my control for a full-time reporter who reports to me, who can do general news. A lot of compromise needs to be happening right now, unfortunately. So this is my 2 cents.
Seattle Times. We subscribe to the Seattle Times 7 days and the New York Times 5 days. And I am particularly interested in international affairs, which, New York Times I'll go to, but I like the Seattle Times because not only do you cover local things, which I am also very interested in, but complementarily, you pick up other news agencies that complement what I get in the New York Times on international, which I think is still very important for you to do.
Yeah, I think we talk a lot about civic engagement and local news, but I think that the model we've done, and we've tuned this over 100 years, is to provide kind of a daily executive briefing for people that drops on your doorstep or on your iPad, however you want. And the idea, it's not so. Part of what we do is we do reporting, we hold people accountable, we do journalism. We also provide kind of a service, an information service, and what you're paying for isn't just the story about the orca or the story about the crooked mayor. You're also, or the Seahawks, you're also paying to have this service where we have a bunch of people that kind of scan the wire services and think, here's a concise package of what's going on that will help you be prepared to be an informed citizen every day. And so that gets lost in the conversation around stories and what we do. It happens at the weekly level too. He's providing a weekly package to be a good citizen of Enumclaw, to know what's going on.
Roger?
You talk about losing reporters, but what happened to the newspaper delivery job opportunities that I had the advantage of making some lunch money when I was in grade school by delivering newspapers, and had to get up pretty early in the morning too. So I guess it was the PI, but that means of getting that paper out at very low expense meant that the paper was also, I think, more affordable than it is now. And that raises the question to me, the subscriptions for the Seattle Times are beyond the reach of people in this town, maybe most even, or at least it's expensive enough that they're, they prefer to use their money elsewhere. So the idea of relying on subscription fees that are expensive, and New York Times, join that club too. I wonder if that's self-defeating ultimately, because how can you build your circulation if you can't have the newspaper on every corner, and you can't have the newspaper going into the houses of people of all income levels?
Well, it's a good point. And I used to deliver the Seattle Times too when I was a kid. We no longer have the density of population to do the kid routes, for one thing. I mean, we have a density of population. We don't have the density of subscribers within that population to make that work. And there's, if you did that today in Seattle, those kids would have to get paid $19 an hour under the Seattle minimum wage. So that also makes it a little bit more difficult. But really, it was the shift from advertising subsidized subscriptions that we made. It was more important to get newspapers into people's hands, even for free, because that would help us sell more ads. Now we're to the point where there are so many fewer ads, we need to make money on subscriptions. Finding the right balance in, like, we have to charge enough to cover the cost and survive, but not so much that we become exclusive and shrink. That's you're right. You pinpointed the great challenge for the industry, is finding that point. Hopefully, if we can rejigger the relationship with Google and Facebook and get a better and their antitrust enforcers do a good job, maybe our advertising and our revenue from those folks will come up, and we won't have to charge so much for subscriptions, and then then that algorithm will work better for people like you and me, who it's expensive to get the newspaper. And I think that's too bad, because we want to have as many people as possible have this thing available.
Nancy? Is this on? Okay, I'm a former newspaper kid too. I delivered the Columbus Citizen and the Columbus Dispatch, which was much heavier.
Just, Nancy, a little closer to your...
Okay.
Thank you.
Extraneous stuff. What I want to know is, what's the Gannett? What is their influence? They have so many newspapers. Is their influence editorial, or tell me how that works?
Well, it's a business, and the business model that some of these chains are pursuing is to build as big of a national network to sell to advertisers. Frankly, in online, it's all about scale. The winners are the biggest. That's why Google's the winner, and that's why Facebook's a winner. And so these newspaper chains are pursuing a model where they can say, we have one company touches millions of Americans, and they think they can sell more ads that way. They do have a lot of influence. They're kind of funny, though. They've been cutting back on their editorializing and opinion pages. So you'd think they'd have this mighty megaphone they could use to influence people. But they, in their wisdom, they think that, choosing which president to vote for and suggesting that will alienate readers. So they've cut back on their editorial pages across the country. It's a business, though. I mean, the Gannett has been bought and sold, and it's deeply indebted. It owes over $1 billion to its financiers. They're the ones who are getting rich. If they hadn't done all these financial shenanigans, they'd have a lot more money to put in their newsrooms. They wouldn't be down to a couple new reporters. But instead, they're paying these huge interest payments to the financiers, and the hedge funds that bought them and sold them made a lot of money. So billions of dollars have been skimmed out of that company that are going to basically Wall Street. And I could go on, but does that answer your question?
Kind of. They don't have a particular editorial viewpoint then?
Well, I mean,
The Gannett newspaper chain?
Yeah, they write opinion things sometimes, but they've decided to de-emphasize local opinion pages. No.
Any more questions? Oh, Roger wants to go twice.
Well, why not? I have an appreciation, I think, for newspapers because they're or have been the fabric of the chronicle of, you know, the country's existence, I guess you could say. And I remember looking at papers from, say, the 20s in relatively small towns, and everybody's wedding, everybody's funeral, everybody's obituary is given a lot of prominence, and you know, the dances at the schools, and who's the queen of the prom, and all this kind of stuff is rich and informative and terribly important, it seems to me. And I don't see how one person can do that. But I also look at the Seattle Times and I'm wondering what happened to the society page. Where are the details about what's going on at you know, Roosevelt High School or Ballard High School or Nathan Hale? There are big gaps in coverage that we're already going to rue, it seems to me, because our history is going under the bridge, and there's nobody there to chronicle a lot of the small details that are probably more important in understanding our times than a lot of these political issues that we waste all the headlines on.
Well, you're right. We have to make hard choices every day. We cover a metro area with 3 million people and a state of 7 million, and we only have so many reporters, and we don't cover as much as we used to. We still cover more than anybody else, but for a single paper, but it's hard, and it's not what it used to be. And I don't know that those glorious days will ever come back again the way they used to.
I have kind of a different opinion on that. A lot of those coverages that Roger is talking about should be covered by a little neighborhood, West Seattle Herald, for instance. All of those little neighborhoods, they covered all of that. And to say that you have to have a city paper, get that detailed, it's putting too much emphasis on that. I grew up in Saratoga Springs, New York, and the Saratogian finally was doing nothing but the social pages. You couldn't get anything beyond social pages. You had to go to a Schenectady paper, an Albany paper. And those papers would be equivalent to the Seattle Times. And so, no, I disagree. You should not spend all that time.
I know for us, we used to also run. Okay, we used to also run a lot of society page stuff, but that was back when the Plateau only had a couple thousand people, and now we're pushing 25, and the city of Black Diamond was ranked #1 in percentage population growth in the city because of a really large housing development, and that's going to continue for the next couple of years. So there's just so much that we would be reporting on, and it's kind of a mass issue. I'm only one person. I want to be able to partner with the local hospital. They used to be able to send us the births, not so much anymore. We still partner with our local funeral home, so we can know who's all doing, who's all dead, because the obituaries remain one of the most popular pages in our newspaper, which is why it's right next to the opinion page, the two right there. But those partnerships are kind of going away because of social media. That's where the community pages are right now, is everyone goes to Facebook, everyone goes to the website formerly known as Twitter, everyone goes to those pages to figure out what's happening. And it is a shame, because I know that if you want to track genealogy, track births, track deaths, you used to normally go to a paper. I don't even know how you would do that on social media anymore. So I wish we could do more with that, but it really is just I got so much time and only make so much money, and I only have a 10 to 12 page paper to fill. And I got to choose between the long form journalism that I like doing and what I consider, junk food news. The police blotter, I think, is a really good example. People like the police blotter, but I find it to be rather empty of news. Like, I can't give a specific address. I can't put in names. People, I think it gives a skewed version of what's happening in my community, that all people will see is crime and DUIs, and Enumclaw and the Plateau is so much more than that. So I only do the blotter if I really have nothing else to do, or if, like today, I need to fill up the paper and I'm not there to do it. I only have so much time to put in between stuff that I find actually informative and what people like to have. So I try and give people a healthy diet, but I'm criticized fairly often for, depriving people of their treats.
Remember when every city had 2 newspapers? And
No.
one of my concerns is that we don't have even two points of view now, that we used to be able to count on the Seattle Times and the Seattle PI disagreeing on some issues. And I thought that was important to get 2 different perspectives. And now we're worrying that one newspaper, is struggling. And in most cities across the country, if you have one viable newspaper, that's a good thing. And I wish there were 2 everywhere, but the online world is not going to go away anytime soon. So we're about out of time. I want to make sure that if anybody else has a question, they have a chance to ask it. Who remembers what's happening in November? Laura. Yes, Nick Licata. Right. So come back here a month from now on the 3rd Monday for Nick Licata. And who remembers what's happening this weekend here at Horizon House? Ann Brand, what?
Healthcare for All Washington annual meeting and educational event from 1 to 3 on Saturday in this hall.
Healthcare, go ahead. Healthcare for All Washington. Laura.
And your ballots will arrive this week.
We will have ballots this week. That's right. What's happening a week from Thursday in the Fireside Lounge? Come on, guys. I made a pitch for it. Coffee with a Cop. Okay, 11 to 1 in the Fireside Lounge. Just drop in, drop out, chat with a cop. Find out bring a safety pin. Check, poke, see if they're actually human. Do they bleed? What happens if you touch one, right? So, yeah, let's check it out. Thank you so much for your participation this morning. Good talk.
I will be sticking around for lunch just in case anybody wants to ask me any more questions.
Yeah.